Welcome to Monday Night Bible Study as we continue our series in the Conversations with Jesus as we're kind of going through the book of John, and we're examining some of the interactions Jesus had with certain individuals. And it's interesting and striking how that a lot of these instances take up entire chapters in the Gospel of John. And I know years ago when I began to look at this and examine these things, thinking there has to be some significant reasons why so much time is spent on these particular conversations, interactions between Jesus and these other people. And so over the years, as I've kind of gone back and forth and studied through this, I've seen that there are some very interesting things. And one reason I wanted to go through this study is because it will illustrate to us some of the things we've studied recently, such as the cycles of judgment for Israel and God's plan and purpose for them. Also, it illustrates to us the importance of learning to rightly divide the word of truth. And also we will examine some constructive, positive Bible study methods in here. And we will see a lot of the background that's behind the things that were said and done. So tonight we're going to go into John chapter 4, and we'll look at the interaction here between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. So let's go ahead and get started as we begin in our scriptures. In John chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee. And he must needs go through Samaria. And cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph." So a couple of questions come up here. It says that Jesus and his disciples were there at the River Jordan, and they were baptizing people the same as John did, because this time, remember, Jesus and John were both preaching the same message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And repent and be baptized. They were both teaching, and the Israelites that they must come and be baptized, that there were two things that they must receive in order to prepare them to go into the kingdom that John and Jesus prophesied was at hand, that it was time for the kingdom to come in. They must receive water baptism and the baptism of the Holy Spirit. John testified of this when he said, "I baptize you with water. There's one coming after me, whose shoes I'm not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire." Some who didn't believe they would get the baptism of fire. But nevertheless, this was the kind of the background. Jesus and his disciples baptizing for the same reason that John was. So the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making more disciples, baptizing people, even more than John did. Now this had to incorporate a lot of people, because if you remember some of the details about John's ministry, it says that all of Judea and Jerusalem and Galilee and the Israelites from everywhere, they flocked in multitudes down there to John to hear his word and to be baptized of him. So if Jesus was baptizing more people than John, then this affected multitudes of people. There was nobody or very few people in Israel that didn't hear the message of John and Jesus in those days, those kind of early days of Jesus' ministry as he went around. So the Pharisees heard this, it says, and so Jesus left Judea and departed again into Galilee. Why? Why did he leave Judea? Why did he leave there when the people were being baptized and so forth? More than likely, and we kind of have to read between the lines here, but knowing the conflict that Jesus had with the Pharisees on and off, it's likely that it was to avert a conflict with the Pharisees, because with them it was all about who had the greatest numbers of followers. And as we know, the Pharisees were very jealous of Jesus. because people were following him, and they were coming to him in multitudes, and believing in him, and these kind of things, which seriously upset the Pharisees, and so they had this conflict with Jesus. They left there, which we notice through the gospel accounts, Jesus often did. If he saw conflict coming, he could have stayed and fought, and he would have won, but he didn't. So he many times would just go. So that's probably the reason why he left there and went up to Galilee. It says that he must needs go through Samaria. Why? Don't really know. Could be several reasons. I think, and this is just me, this is just my opinion, I think it was because his father told him to go through Samaria. Now it could be that he didn't take the road up the Jordan Valley straight up to Galilee because there were maybe places he wanted to avoid, maybe to avoid conflict with the Pharisees or some other reason like that. Just wanted to kind of go off the beaten track, take a different route up into Galilee, and so forth. That very well could be a reason and practical reason why. But I think it could have been that his father told him to go through Samaria. That's why he said he needed to go through there. So he came to this city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. This was an extremely significant place to the nation of Israel, to their history. Many significant things had happened here. In fact, really, they got their start here in this place. This was near Shechem. Sychar and Shechem are not the same place. Sychar was probably a small village near Shechem, but it's there in that area between Mount Abal and Mount Gerizim. So it's a very significant place. Like I said, we're going to cover a lot of background so we understand what's going on here and see some of the things that happened here about Mount Abal and Mount Gerizim. And I'm just really kind of hitting the highlights because I want to try to cover this tonight and not split it up. So I left out really a lot that we could have added in here, but we'll look at enough to kind of get an idea of what happened. Here in Genesis verse 12, it says, "And Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Sichem," which that's Shechem, under a little different spelling, under the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. This plain of Moreh, that's a plain that spreads out from this valley that comes down between Mount Abal and Mount Gerizim. Right in there is Shechem, and that's where this place was, this land was. Very fertile farmland as it is today. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, "Unto thy seed will I give this land." And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. And he moved from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the east, and Bethel on the west, and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Now, one of the things that, if you might remember from one of our earlier studies, we pointed out that when Abram came into the land of Canaan, one of the things God told him to do as soon as he got there was to walk up and down in the land and walk around in it. And this is part of what Abraham was doing there. The reason God told him to do that, and the reason Abraham did that, was as a gesture of possession, a gesture of ownership, by walking up and down in the land. That showed he was God's man in God's place, and he believed God was going to give him that land to his descendants. So here we find Abram in this place near Shechem in the plain of Moreh, and he worshiped the Lord there, set up an altar. And listen, this was right in the middle of absolute pagan culture and people groups there, the Canaanites. These were Satan's people, and the ones he was going to try to use to keep Israel out of that land. But Satan did kind of have an idea of God's plan, especially after he called Abram and sent him there, and so forth. So here's Abram right in the middle of paganism, and he builds an altar and he worships the Lord. So he made it very clear who he was and why he was there, and what God intended to do. Now, later on, here comes Jacob, and he buys a piece of land there. In Genesis 33, it says, and Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and pitched his tent before the city. And he bought a parcel of a field where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. So we see here that Shechem, the city Shechem, was named after the person whose name was Shechem, and so forth. So here we find Jacob there, going right back to the same place where Abram had set up his tent. He'd stayed for a short period of time, worshiped the Lord there, and so forth. And now Jacob comes back to the same place and buys a parcel of field there in that place. And, okay, even though Jacob, let's look at this, he had bought this piece of land for 100 pieces of money. I think another place says 100 pieces of silver. So clearly it states he bought the land, but apparently he still had to fight for it. It says, and Israel said unto Joseph, behold, I die. In Genesis 48 here. So, but God shall be with you and bring you again unto the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow. So there are probably some details of their history there that haven't been added in the Bible, that apparently Jacob had paid for this land, but there may have been some conflict there, and he still ended up, for some reason or other, having to fight for it out of the hands of the Amorites, who were the ones the specific tribe who owned the land before. So this is kind of a little bit of the history behind right here, where it says, where are we? Yeah, then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. So that's kind of the background there. It shows us Abraham had been there, Jacob came there and bought that piece of land there in that place. And then he says, moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. That's how that parcel of ground came into the possession of Joseph and his descendants. Now, in Joshua 24, this is interesting. It says, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem, in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver. And it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph. Now, the people that lived in Samaria knew this and remembered this. And they tied their inheritance all the way back to this. Because here's one of the things we want to point out in this study tonight about the woman of Samaria. You may be like me and, for a long time, kind of assumed that this Samaritan woman was kind of a Gentile, or that she wasn't, pure Israelite or anything like that. We've probably all heard that many of the Samaritans were considered to be sort of half Israelite and half something else after the Assyrian captivity when they came back to the land and so forth. And the Assyrians sent foreigners into the land, and they also were some Israelites there and so forth. We've probably heard that. I know I've heard that for years, until there were some things that stood out to me as I read this. I said, hey, wait a minute. So I looked into it and found out that actually that's not the case. These Samaritans were full descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But there was a division between them and the Jews, and we're going to look at tonight the real reason why that division existed between them. And this is going to go back into the historical background, and you'll recognize it as some of the things we've looked at before, specifically in the 5 cycles of judgment. And we'll see why it's important to learn those things. Those basics of the cycles of judgment are very important, because it gives us an accurate understanding of the entire Bible. So, Joseph was buried there in this place. Now back to John 4. It says, now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. Probably around noon, depending on whose kind of time you use. Probably about noon, so where they consider the 6th hour. The night was divided into watches, the day was divided into hours. Remember, Jesus said, are there not 12 hours in the day, and so forth. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water, which was odd to begin with, because they normally would go first thing in the morning to draw water, and they would go last thing in the day to draw their water. So for this woman to come at noon, kind of said a lot of things, which we won't go into. We kind of have to speculate. But anyway, here she came to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away into the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Why not? Why didn't the Jews have any dealings with the Samaritans? Where did that division come from? And what was the reasons behind that? Why to not even ask a drink of water from someone, you really have a problem. Let's look at some background here. Now, this also shows us one thing that she knew. Remember Jesus and Nicodemus? We talked about the things that Nicodemus knew, or he thought he knew, but Jesus knew what he really knew. And then also with Nathanael, we talked about Jesus knew the things Nathanael knew. That's why he interacted with him the way he did. But there were some things this lady thought that she knew too. She knew that it was totally unheard of for a Jewish man to ask a drink of water from any Samaritan, especially a Samaritan woman. So let's look at where their bad history started. Why was there a division between the Jews and the Samaritans? We'll go back to the beginning of the second cycle of judgment. This is when the division began between the 10 tribes of Israel in the north and Judah and Benjamin in the south. 1 Kings 12. Remember, this is after Solomon's death. And Rehoboam, his son, says he went to Shechem, for all Israel were come to Shechem to make him king. Notice that place? Where are we again? We're right back in Shechem. So one of the things we want to see is that this is an extremely significant place for all of Israel. And think about this. When Jesus went there, and here I believe, like I said, it's just my opinion, but very well could be. His father told him, I want you to go through Samaria. Didn't tell him why, and this was kind of part of Jesus' education, perfection as his son. His father educated him, just like he wants to educate us as mature sons and daughters laboring with him. So he went there, and as Jesus sat down on this well, Shechem was somewhere there near. Mount Ebal over there, and Mount Gerizim there. As he sat there, he knew of all those things. He knew of all the things that were significant to Israel, and all the things that had happened there. This was also, Joshua had been there. When they came into the land, Moses had told them, put half the tribes up on Mount Ebal, and half the tribes up on Mount Gerizim. And tribes over here are to shout out the blessings. And if you do this, God will send these blessings. And the 12 tribes over there, or the other half of the tribes over there, shout out these curses. And if you don't follow the Lord and don't listen to Him and don't keep His commandments, then these curses will happen. And all these things. And here, close in this area, Joshua set up those standing stones, and they wrote the law on these stones as stones of remembrance and all these things. And all the way back to Abraham and Jacob when they had been there. And Jesus knew all these things. And as he sat there on the well, I think he understood how significant that place was. And I wonder if anybody else really did. Maybe it just kind of seemed sort of as a unimportant place to them. But here we find Rehoboam went back to Shechem, and there they were going to make him king. The king answered the people roughly, and forsook the old men's counsel that they gave him, and spake to them after the counsel of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, and I'll add to your yoke. My father also chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. So when all Israel saw that the king hearkened not unto them, the people answered the king, saying, What portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to thine own house, David. So Israel departed unto their tents. So here we have that division. And if you remember, as one of the stipulations or the judgments of the second cycle, God said, I will break the pride of your power. And what he meant there, that he would divide that nation. They became divided immediately after Solomon's death, when Rehoboam and Jeroboam came into power there. And an instant conflict, and they separated into civil war. And they never united again. They stayed separated all the way up until the captivity. After the captivity, they stayed separated and had conflict from then on. When Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the house of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men, which were warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom again to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. So here they go, armed, and they were going to have armed conflict. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in Mount Ephraim, and dwelt therein, and went out from thence and built Penuel. Now, in the Bible we'll find sometimes it'll talk about a king built a certain city, and we'll say, well, hey, wait a minute, wasn't that city already there? Yes, it was. But a lot of times what these kings in ancient times would do, when they came in to take over, if the king before them had built stuff in a certain city, especially a prominent city, what do you think they're going to do? Tear it all down. Tear all that down, and we're going to build it new. So that's what they would do. They would go in there, knock all the old stuff down, and rebuild it new. They wouldn't completely flatten the whole city, unless it was an enemy city, which this wasn't. But they would, tear down prominent buildings and things, and they would rebuild the city like they wanted. And many times they would rename it and rededicate it and all those kind of things. So that's what we see happening here. This also accounts for, and I'm not sure that archaeologists always take this into account when they excavate through the different occupation levels of a city, and some of these occupation levels will show destruction, maybe not with fire, but with destruction, and then immediately rebuilding on top of it. And often they assign longer ages of time there than it warrants, because I don't know that they take into account that sometimes a king would go in, tear down a city, and immediately rebuild it like he wanted it to be. So anyway, we find that. And there are some places where they've seen that in the archaeological excavations, that this is what happened. You can see right here, that's what happened. But that's what happened here. Jeroboam said in his heart, Now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. If this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam king of Judah, and they shall kill me, and go again to Rehoboam king of Judah. Whereupon the king took counsel, and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto them, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So here's what Jeroboam did. He said, we're building a new capital here in Shechem. We're building our own nation up here, the 10 tribes of Israel. We don't want anybody going down to Jerusalem, to the temple, to worship there anymore. We can't have that, because then they'll tend to be loyal to Rehoboam there. We've got to break that connection between the people in the north, the 10 tribes of Israel up here, and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south. So we've got to break that connection. We can't do that unless we give the people up here a place to worship as well. So what Jeroboam did is he introduced a counterfeit, a substitute place to worship, and substitute gods, 2 calves of gold, and he set those up, and that became a trap and a snare to Israel, became a stumbling block unto them. And over, if you remember, as we went through the cycles of judgment, again and again it was brought up that this king caused the people to follow after the sins of Jeroboam, that set up the 2 golden calves and made Israel to sin and provoked the Lord to anger, and so forth. And so the consecutive cycles of judgment. So that's what he did. He set up a counterfeit religious system. And the people in Samaria, when Jesus got there, now they weren't worshiping golden calves, but they had continued in a counterfeit, vain religious system. So that's what they were in. And we'll look at that again here in a second. Now, also, the Samaritans' canon, their scriptures, contains, and still does to this day, only the Pentateuch, only the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what they have. They regard those as the scriptures, the final scriptures. One of the reasons for that is because at the time of the division of the nations, those were the scriptures they had. They didn't have any of the prophets yet, except for maybe some writings of Samuel, some of the things he wrote down. But even those writings of Samuel may not have been accepted into the canon of scriptures yet, even at that time, or especially not by Israel in the north. So that was their Bible, and it is today. Their scriptures only contain the first 5 books of Moses. They don't have any of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea and Joel, and all those. Don't have any of those. They don't have the Psalms. They don't have Proverbs. They don't have Job or Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, any of the Ruth, any of the rest of those. Just Moses' book. So that's one of the biggest reasons why there's a division between the Jews and the Samaritans. And it also is one of the reasons why Jesus said some of the things he did to the Samaritans and about the Samaritans. If you remember the instructions Jesus gave his disciples when he sent them out to preach the gospel, he said, don't go to any of the Gentiles and don't go into the city of the Samaritans. Well, there's a reason why he told them not to go to the Samaritans. It's not because they weren't Israelites, but they didn't have the prophets. So they did not have the scriptural background to know the things they needed to know to be prepared for what the disciples were going to go and tell them. The Messiah is here, repent for the kingdom is at hand, and here's what you need to do to prepare yourself to enter into the kingdom. That wouldn't have done the Samaritans any good because they didn't have the majority of the scriptures that they needed to educate them in those things. So anyway, this is kind of the reason why. It's in the background why the division was there. Didn't have anything to do with racial stuff, that they weren't descendants of Abraham. Okay. They had their own inaccurate folklore about the Messiah. We'll see as the lady makes this statement here. Back to John 4, verse 10. Jesus answered and said unto her, and remember, he just asked her for a drink of water. She said, you as a Jew, asked me for a drink, and blah, blah. Jesus answered and said unto her, if thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. Well, here's two interesting things Jesus said. And she heard the living water part, but I think there's a part here that just went right over her head, and she didn't even hear it, because Jesus made a statement here that almost nobody saw God as. Point number 1, had the Samaritans not rejected all the scriptures besides those of Moses, she would have known who Jesus was and what he meant about living water. Point number 2, I think she missed it. Her reaction could have been, wait a minute. The gift of God? Are you telling me God's a gift giver? Well, I've never heard anything about God being a gift giver. All I've ever heard that we had to work and earn his blessings by our good works, So this would have been something new. I don't think she heard it anyway. Went right by her. But here Jesus said, God's, to give you the gift. The gift, he gives living water, eternal life. Now back to John 4. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? So see, here this woman makes a statement right here, that she identifies herself with Jacob, also with Joseph, who he gave that parcel of land to. So this right here indicates to us that this woman knew her lineage and knew her connection back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which points out to us that this Samaritan woman was full Israelite. And she, was not a half-breed or anything like that, like we often hear about the Samaritans. She identified herself not only with Jacob, but also with Jesus as well. She said, "Our father Jacob," identifying herself with him, see, in the common lineage. And also, this signifies her connection to the land. See, she did understand that. And the one thing that they had and they understood was the Abrahamic covenant. Where God said, "I'll give you this land and your descendants as an inheritance forever." So, she'll make another statement here in a minute that also reaffirms her connection with Jesus and her lineage back to Abraham. Let's go ahead. And I think I talked about that. What she knew, her connection to the land. They were not part of the mixed race that came back after the Assyrian captivity. We talked about that. Back to John 4. Jesus answered and said unto her, "Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life." The woman saith unto him, "Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw." Now, I think Jesus is making reference to this verse in Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3, which says, "Therefore with joy shall you draw water out of the wells of salvation." That's I think, kind of the whole situation here set that up. And that's what he has in his mind. That's what he's thinking. And that's the message he wants to communicate to this woman and to these people. And we could really go on a long time about why this particular woman and she was kind of an outcast and all these kind of things, and I guess maybe the impact that it had when she went back to town and said the things that she did to the men there, the people there, it had an impact on them. It's interesting, we could make this point, won't dwell on it. Now, the Lord many times will use the least likely person, for one of the greatest of things He wants done, to deliver the very pointed message. Now, she was certain in her mind of some things that she knew to be factual, but Jesus shows her what He knows when she says, "Well, Mr. Living Water, the well's pretty deep. Now, I don't see you with a rope or a bucket. Where are you going to get this living water?" And so on. So He says, "Oh, okay, tell you what. Well, let's go ahead and read it. The woman said unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Jesus saith unto her, Go call your husband and come hither." So right then, what was going through this woman's mind. And this was like, an alarming statement to her. And she answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband. For thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that saidst thou truly. Now, had you been living in the village of Sychar, this would not have been news to you. Everybody in town, it had been like living in Blooming Grove. Everybody in town knew who you were, knew all your business. If they didn't know your business, they'd make up something, So, everybody knew about this woman's history. She had all these different husbands and all these things, and now she's living with this man she's not married to, and all that kind of stuff, so forth. And the people around there would have known that, but the question is, how did this stranger know this? No, I've never seen this guy. The Jews don't really come through here because it, probably a little bit out of the way. And if they do come here, they just pass through. They don't stop and talk to anybody because they don't want to have anything to do with Samaritans because they think it'll defile them or whatever. And so they just keep on going. Now, how did this stranger know that? And say that to her. So let's look. John 4:19, the woman said unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Now, our fathers refers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For they all worshipped in that place. This also signifies her lineage to Abraham and her connection with Jesus. So there's two statements this woman made that affirmed her lineage back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So she was not a Gentile or part of a Gentile. She was a full Israelite, but part of the Samaritans who were part of that divided nation, with the 10 tribes of Israel in the north, who only had part of the scriptures, didn't have the prophets and the writings and the Psalms and all those things that they needed to have in order to point them to the Messiah. Those characteristics to look for, so that when the Messiah showed up, they would recognize him. Now, the Jews had these things, and a few people did see those things, and they did recognize Jesus when he showed up. Unfortunately, the majority of them did not, because they had this, over-traditionalized or folklorish view of what they thought the Messiah would be, and how he would be, and what he would do when he showed up, and Jesus didn't fit any of that. So instead of going to the Scriptures and reading the Scriptures and just believing it, they rejected Jesus. So they kind of were without excuse there. The Samaritans, they really didn't have much of an excuse either, because they had rejected the prophets and so forth. But they were at least in ignorance about these things. But she made this statement. When it became obvious that, wait a minute, he knows things that nobody should be able to know. He must be a prophet to know these things that nobody else would know. That's what she's thinking. So she begins with the conflict of the ages between the Jews and the Samaritans. Well, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, Mount Gerizim, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. So if you're a prophet, what do you say? Now, which seems kind of odd, because the Samaritans had rejected all the prophets. They even rejected their own prophets. So I don't know what she thinks Jesus is going to tell her, other than maybe she's trying to bring up kind of a conversation to lead it off in a direction and get it away from a touchy subject of how many husbands she had had. So could be a lot of reasons there, but nevertheless, it's an interesting thing. And she is beginning to understand that Jesus is a prophet, but she confirms her lineage with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and understood her history all the way back. If you wanted to look up some additional details, you could go to the book of Nehemiah in chapter 4, when it talks about Sanballat and Tobiah and some of the other ones. Many of the Samaritans, who were ancestors of this woman, they were there in place when the Jews came back to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the wall, rebuild the temple, and all those things. Some of those people were the ones who opposed the Jews and tried to prevent them from rebuilding the temple. So that conflict was ongoing all through the ages there. Samaria was built and destroyed several times. The Samaritans built a temple there and places of worship, and they were destroyed a time or two and rebuilt and so forth. All right. Water emergency.
Not anymore.
Woke you up?
Yeah. Lots of fun.
All right. Where were we?
Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Mount Gerizim, they believed, was the proper place of worship. In Eerdmans, we find a schism made complete by the building of the Samaritan temple. Here it is. I knew I had a note about this on here. Early in the 4th century BC. And that's where they believed that proper worship be conducted instead of Jerusalem. And there were some other reasons for it. But Jesus, as was typical of him, doesn't go off on the sideline issue. He gets straight to the point of the greater issue. In verse 21 he says, "And her woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship Him. God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth." Not in a counterfeit, vain religious system, which is what the Samaritans had, and also the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all those Jewish rulers, the nation of Israel at large had. Both of them did. A vain religious system, a counterfeit. It looked like the real thing, sounded a lot like the real thing, incorporated a lot of the elements of the real thing, but it wasn't. It was counterfeit. And that's what they had. And this goes all the way back to that which Jeroboam set up. And here's one of the things we want to remember. The things Jesus said and taught go all the way back to the things Moses spoke and wrote and set down in the law and in all those things that God set for them to do and in the covenants He made with them. They go all the way back to that. When Jesus made that statement, God is a spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth, He's going all the way back specifically to those Samaritans, reminding them of that counterfeit that started when Jeroboam set up those 2 golden calves and misled that whole 10 tribes off into terrible idolatry. And they wound up in captivity and destruction and all those kind of things. Let's break this down a little bit. Let's see, I think I've got this. Yeah, all right, some key words here in this statement Jesus made. It says, "The hour cometh." That was because of the increasing rejection of Jesus by the Jewish rulers. They were heading in that direction, and it didn't look like they were going to turn around and accept Him as the Messiah and lead the people that way. Many people were believing in Christ, but the majority apparently were not, and the rulers were not. And a lot of significant things about that, about the rulers, because they had the position and who they were, they had the responsibility to lead the people in that direction, and they didn't. It says, "Ye know not what." They didn't have accurate knowledge of the Father. They had a little bit of knowledge about God because they had the first 5 books of the Bible, but they didn't have the rest of it. So the Samaritans were in the dark on a lot of what they needed to know of God's plan and purpose for them. So that's why He said, you know not what you worship. And we know what we worship because salvation is of the Jews. That's because the Jews at least had kept all of the Scriptures accurately, specifically, had maintained the Scriptures there, and they taught it, they learned it, many of them believed it, and so forth. They guarded it and kept it accurate and preserved it. All the prophets and the writings and everything. Now, he says the true worshipers, this is a reference to the believing remnant of Israel. Remember, at this time, this is still under Israel's program. He's not talking to or about any Gentiles. If Gentiles wanted to be saved during this time, they had to become Jewish proselytes, or they had to bless Israel. They had to, act and live in a way that was a blessing unto the nation of Israel. They had to put off their old pagan gods and worship the one true God. That's how Gentiles were saved in that period of time. That was before the dispensation of grace that we're in. True worshipers is a reference to the believing remnant of Israel, which the Samaritans could come in and be a part of. And then he said, in spirit and truth, not in physical rituals, not in falsehood or error. Now, the spirit is worship in life, not just religious observances and religious rituals and all those kind of things they did, because they had those things, and they had them fairly accurately, and they went through all the feasts and kept all those things. In fact, the modern day Samaritans there in Israel, they keep several of the feasts and all those things, just like the Orthodox Jews do. They had all those things, but Jesus said, hey, wait a minute, that's not the true worship of the Father. It must be done in spirit. And he said also in truth, not in falsehood or error or personal opinion or denominational tradition or any of that stuff. Now, how did she know this? The woman said to him, now I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. How did she know that? How did she have any idea that Messiah was coming? And why did she believe that when he came, he would tell them all things? Well, probably, maybe one reason they believed that is because they understood that there were a lot of things they didn't know, which had they accepted the Scriptures, they would have known. But she had at least some belief that the Messiah would come. How did she even know about that? From the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 12, I'll make of thee a great nation, and bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. This contains a messianic prophecy, also that the nation of Israel would be head of the nations, and they would be a blessing to the whole earth. God would use them to repossess the earth instead of his kingdom. In Genesis 49, Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you, when? In the last days. So think about this. Whenever you read there in Genesis 49 there, where Jacob blesses his sons, and also, I would encourage you, if you want to, with this in mind, go back and read that, Jacob's prophecies to his sons in Genesis 49, and notice that none of those prophecies ever came true within any of their lifetimes. And the reason why is because Jacob, the prophet, was telling them that which would befall them in the last days. Remember what we talked about when the last days are? They're that last 7 years prophesied by Daniel the prophet. Daniel's 70th week, when the program with Israel will resume and God will finish up his covenant business with them. Those are the last days. And so, anyway, these will happen in the last days. Now, also remember this. Had the prophetic plan gone as it was originally set to go, uninterrupted by the dispensation of grace, which we're in now, then in Jesus' times and the apostles, they were in the last days. And had it not been interrupted, as you remember here by the dispensation of grace, and when Paul was called out and God gave him, or Jesus gave him the gospel of grace for the age of the body of Christ that we're in now, had that not happened, then the last 7 years would have come probably during Peter and those apostles' lifetime, and those final judgments and things would have happened then. That's what they were looking for. Even Peter and some of them signified that they were in the last days, because they didn't know about the mystery. They didn't know that God was going to suspend Israel's program and bring in the dispensation of grace. So anyway, not to get way off in that again, but that's kind of what we're talking about here. And it's significant that Jacob said he'll tell them what will happen in the last days. He said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, who carries the scepter the king does, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. That's a messianic prophecy. So this is one of the prophecies she would have known from our father Jacob, signifying that the Savior, the Messiah, the King would come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Excuse me. Binding his foal unto the vine, and as his colt unto the choice vine. Excuse me. He washed his garments in wine and his clothes in the blood of grapes. Does that sound familiar? There, Jacob's prophecy to his son Judah about what would happen in the last days of his... Man, you see this prophecy? When did that happen? That time when Jesus was about to ride into Jerusalem. And the one time that people were going to recognize him as the Messiah coming into his city, as it was prophesied, behold, your king comes to you, lowly and riding on a colt, foal of an ass and so forth. And we think that was all just coincidence? We think that just happened? No, that was specific fulfillment of this specific prophecy that Jacob gave then. And, when he sent his disciples, he said, go and you'll find an ass and its colt tied there by the door and bring it here. Well, I guarantee you, when they walked up there, what do you think it was tied to? It was tied to a vine outside the door of that house. Because even if you go into Israel today, outside the door of their house, they plant grapevines out there. And they plant fig trees. Because they're still looking for that prophecy to be fulfilled. When a day comes that every man will dwell under his vine and under his fig tree. See, they're looking for that. And in those days, they did the same thing. So, this was a specific prophecy. She would have known this. Jesus' disciples would have also known this. I don't know, maybe it didn't ring with them when it happened, but it fulfilled this prophecy. So there are some things, yes, she would have known that it was prophesied that the Messiah was to come. Hear what Moses said in Deuteronomy 18:15. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken, according to all that thou desirest of the Lord thy God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, neither let me see this great fire any more, that I die not. And the Lord said unto me, they have well spoken that which they have spoken. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. Remember one of the things Jesus said? He said, what the Father tells me, I speak. I speak his word. I came to do his work and to speak his word. So she would have known this prophecy about the Messiah. Now, Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. This was one of the few times that Jesus just ever really kind of flat out made it clear to anybody that I'm him. I'm the one you're looking for. I that speak unto thee am he. Now, we know the rest of the story, and for time, because we need to draw it to a close. I didn't add in the rest of the story. Y'all remember the rest of the story. At this point, when Jesus said this to her, she set down her water pot and she ran back into the town. And she said, hey, there's a man out here. You guys have got to come hear this man. He told me everything I've ever done. And boy, that had a pretty good impact on those men. Maybe there's probably a whole lot more to her story than we have in this short account. So they said, man, he knows all the things you've done. Well, and here's another thing too. By knowing what she had done, that probably ties in that he would also know what maybe some of those men had done. She may have had a lot more to do with a lot more of the men in that town than what any of them wanted to admit and let on to. So maybe they wanted to go out there and check this out first, make sure he doesn't, say anything indiscreet out there, getting him in trouble. Could have been that factor. But one way or another, when she went back into that town, there was something about her that they noticed was different. Because, now notice, she became a believer. Jesus didn't tell her, look, wait. Drop some water here out of this well, a bunch of it. You need to be baptized. Well, hang on now. You need to walk down the aisle and say the sinner's prayer. Or you need to, invite me into your heart. He didn't say any of that. He told her who he was, confirmed to her the scripture, and she believed it. And, she gave evidence that she believed it. And she went and, testified, hey, you're going to come hear this man. This has got to be the Christ. This is the Messiah. She testified who he was, showing that she believed. And so that had a great impact on all the people in the city. Many of them got saved. And I think that one of the things that was important about this, and one of the reasons why I believe that the Father told the Son, go through Samaria. And Jesus knew as a son there was something important there. Maybe he didn't know all the details. He just went there. Sure enough, this happened. And as soon as this happened with this woman, Jesus knew, he knew exactly why the Father had sent him there. If that indeed was the case. It's probably one of the reasons why when the disciples came and they were going to get food and they came up there and they said, we brought food here, have something to eat. And Jesus made that statement. He said, I've got food to eat that you don't know anything about, that you know not of. Because for Jesus, he understood, he got it, how significant it was of what had just happened. Because see, he did something that nobody else could have done. Nobody ever could have done. He came in there and he did the thing that it took to begin to correct that mistake that was made all the way back there with Jeroboam. When he brought in that counterfeit and he led that entire 10 tribes off into a counterfeit, vain religious system. And so Jesus was there. He did the thing that it took to begin the correction. And then we know later on, we can go and read in the book of Acts, when the disciples were scattered because of persecution, there in those early chapters there, and many of them went up into Samaria. And what happened there, they went into the cities and they were preaching the gospel, and multitudes of Samaritans came to Christ. And there really was a tremendous collecting or gathering out of the believing remnant of Israel among those Samaritans up there. And so what happened that day set the stage for what would come later. And a mighty move of the Lord, and many people came to know Christ, and they had strong churches up there, groups and so forth, and all that, all because of this, what may seem like a chance meeting, but I don't believe it was a chance meeting. So anyway, good stuff, good story. Anybody got any questions or comments?
I think it was God's divine plan that she, went there to that well. I mean, she went there with her water pot, but the well was too deep. She wasn't going to be able to draw any water. So,
Well, she probably had, the rope and the well bucket was there. It stayed there all the time. And you just, you came with your pot and you let the bucket down there and filled up your pot and carried it back home. But still, to her, it was just going to be another day, just going to the well, a mundane chore, and, never expected anything like that to happen. So, she went for just a jug of water and got a whole lot more. A whole lot more. Interesting thing about Jacob's well, that well is there today. Of course, it's up in Palestinian territories. You can go there, to Samaria and so forth. It's kind of on our list. We'd like to go there someday. But anyway, you can go to Jacob's well, and it is one of the few places in Israel that you can go to and know that is it. The well's been there ever since then, and you can go there and know that's the place. It's kind of like the pool of Siloam, the excavations there. You can go there, that's the place. And like the first century street we went to, I can't remember at that Davidson Center. At the Davidson Center, it's a street there outside the temple wall and so forth. It was the first century street. Jesus would have been there. And there are a few places that are biblical places, and that's one of them. So anyway, interesting thing.
Well, as I was studying this today, I didn't realize that this is the only place that Jacob's well is even mentioned.
Yeah. Even in those accounts back there in Genesis, where it says he went in the land, he bought the land, and did all those things around it. Never mentions anything about a well. Now, you know, it's odd. Isaac had his servants dig wells everywhere, you know, but it never mentions Jacob digging wells or anything about it. So yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah.
So-
And one of the details I said, it was like, after they cleaned it out, it was like 137 feet deep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one other thing, there's several things that have taken places at wells, like this lady and Rachel
And Rebecca.
Rebecca.
Mhm. Moses at the
and there was another-
fighting the Midianites off of the well, and you know, for the daughters of Jethro and so forth. Yeah, wells are very significant and prominent, you know, there, and especially in ancient times.
Well, it was probably like a gathering place anyway, where
Mhm.
they came and,
Yeah. Well, I think that's one reason why this lady was going there at noon to draw her water, because as the custom was, most of the women or girls went early in the morning to draw their water, and they went late in the day to draw their water. Well, when they all showed up at the well early in the morning to draw their water, what do you think they did? I'm sure they didn't gossip it or anything about that, you know. So there was one time this gal was not going to be there, because you talk about the pariah in the village, you know, and she may not have been the only one that was like that, but, you know, she wasn't going to go there when all the other women were there, because, you know, boy, you talk about ruffling some hen feathers, it would have, so she stayed away. Yeah, interesting stuff. All right, if there's nothing else, let's pray and we'll close. Father, we thank you for